On the corner of Broadway and 44th Street, before the neon fully conquered the night, there stood a phantom king. The Hotel Astor. A Beaux-Arts leviathan of red brick and limestone rising from the mud of Longacre Square. 11 stories of gilded silence topped by a copper-green mansard roof that signaled sanctuary to the world's elite. Inside, 1,000 rooms wrapped in velvet and gold leaf. Outside, the deafening mechanical roar of a city inventing itself. It was a palace built to last 1,000 years, a fortress of old-world money planted in the heart of the electric district. But today, if you touch the walls that stand there now, you feel only cold glass. The king is gone. It begins with dust. It begins with a gray, choking powder that settles on the shoulders of Midtown Manhattan, a fine grit that tastes of plaster, pulverized marble, and the accumulated secrets of 63 years. It is the winter of 1967, and on the corner of Broadway and 44th Street, a leviathan is dying. If you were there, standing amidst the honking taxicabs and the rising tide of sleaze that was beginning to claim Times Square, you would have felt the ground shake. This was not the vibration of the subway, but the rhythmic, thunderous impact of the headache ball. A massive iron pendulum swinging against a facade that had once defined the very concept of American elegance. People stopped to watch, of course. New Yorkers always stop to watch a tragedy if it is loud enough. They stood in their overcoats, collars turned up against the wind, witnessing the systematic dismemberment of the Hotel Astor. It was a spectacle of violence disguised as progress. The mansard roof, a copper-green crown that had once signaled sanctuary to kings and captains of industry, was peeled back like the skin of an orange, exposing the steel ribs beneath. The windows, thousands of them, which had framed the changing face of the city for over half a century, were shattered voids, looking out blindly onto a world that no longer had use for them. To understand the death of the Astor is to understand a specific kind of American murder, the killing of the past to feed the future. This was not just a hotel. It was a machine for living, a fortress of social stratification, and for a brief, glittering moment the center of the known universe. But in 1967, it was just debris. The wrecking crews didn't care about the banquets held in the ballroom or the treaties whispered in the corridors. They were paid by the ton. And so, the building that had anchored Times Square before it was even called Times Square was erased, not by war or fire, but by the cold, indifferent arithmetic of real estate. The air tasted of wood smoke and old money, disintegrating. This is the story of a ghost that spans an entire city block, a ghost that reminds us that in New York, nothing, absolutely nothing, is sacred if the land beneath it is worth more than the stone upon it. The origin of this stone colossus lies not in a blueprint, but in a feud. To understand the Astor, you must first understand the psychological architecture of the family that named it. The Astors were American royalty, a dynasty built on fur and real estate, but by the turn of the 20th century, the family was rotting from the inside, poisoned by envy and petty squabbles. William Waldorf Astor, the man whose money would rise as the Hotel Astor, was a man consumed by a prickly, defensive pride. He was a man who felt the walls of New York closing in on him, largely because his aunt, the formidable Caroline Astor, reigned supreme over society and refused to acknowledge his wife's status. It was a battle of invitation lists and ballroom capacities, fought with the weapons of gilded exclusion. William, sullen and sensitive, retreated to England, choosing exile over submission, but he left his money behind to fight his battles. He decided to strike back at the city that had annoyed him by changing its skyline. He had already demolished his own father's mansion to build the Waldorf Hotel, an act of spite that birthed a legend, but the Hotel Astor was to be something different. It was a gamble born of immense hubris. In 1904, the center of gravity for New York's high society was firmly tethered to 34th Street and 5th Avenue. To build a luxury hotel at 44th Street and Broadway was considered an act of financial suicide. This was the hinterlands. This was Longacre Square, a district of carriage trade, horse stables, and the distinct, pungent aroma of manure. It was a place where you went to fix a wagon wheel, not to dine on lobster thermidor. But William Waldorf Astor, viewing the chessboard from across the Atlantic, saw something others missed. He saw the northward creep of the city. He saw the potential of the subway lines that were being dug through the bedrock. He was driven by a vision of a new center, a monument that would force the city to come to him. It was a decision made in isolation, a wealthy man moving pieces on a map, indifferent to the mud and the grime that currently occupied the site. He would build a palace in a horse pasture, and he would wait for the world to catch up. The land itself was a challenge, a swamp of existing structures and entrenched habits that had to be swept away. Longacre Square was the city's garage, a chaotic junction of blacksmiths and harness makers, illuminated by gaslight and the flickering lanterns of carriage drivers. It was noisy, dirty, and decidedly working class. To plant a Beaux-Arts masterpiece here was an act of architectural aggression. The architects chosen for this invasion were Clinton and Russell, a firm known for their ability to translate vast wealth into stone reality. They did not design a building that blended in. They designed a rebuke to the neighborhood. They looked to France for inspiration, specifically the grand hotels of Paris and the chateaux of the Loire Valley. They envisioned a structure that was unapologetically European, a massive pile of red brick and limestone that would occupy a trapezoidal island of land, dominating the visual field from every approach. The design was heavy, fortified, and ornate. It featured a deep, copper mansard roof, a signature that would become a landmark for miles. But this was not just about aesthetics. It was about presence. The building was designed to be a self-contained city, a fortress against the untamed nature of the district. The walls were thick, the foundations deep. As the steel frame began to rise in 1902, it looked less like a hotel and more like a citadel under construction. The locals, the carriage drivers, and the stable hands watched with skepticism. They called it Astor's folly. Who would come this far north? Who would wade through the mud of Longacre Square to sleep in a bed, no matter how soft the linens? The construction site was a hive of immigrant labor, a babel of languages shouting over the riveting of steel. This was the physical manifestation of the Astor fortune. Capital converted into labor, labor converted into stone. It was a slow, deliberate process of imposing order on chaos, a massive financial wager that the center of the world could be moved by sheer force of will. The skeleton of the hotel rose floor by floor, a dark grid against the sky, waiting for the skin of limestone that would dress it for the ball. However, a building, no matter how grand, is merely a shell without a soul to animate it. William Waldorf Astor was the financier, the distant god providing the thunderbolts of cash, but he was not an innkeeper. He needed a high priest to manage the temple. Enter the Muschenheim brothers, William and Frederick. These were not mere managers. They were logistics geniuses, men who understood that a luxury hotel is essentially a military operation disguised as a pleasure palace. William Muschenheim had already made a name for himself as a restaurateur, a man who knew that the way to New York's heart was through its stomach. He approached Astor with a proposition that would define the hotel's destiny. He didn't just want to run it, he wanted to curate it. The negotiations were intense. Astor, the absentee landlord, demanded perfection and profit. Muschenheim demanded control. The contract they struck was the software that would run the hardware of the Astor. It was Muschenheim who understood the changing demographics of the city. He saw that the new subway station opening at Times Square would bring a different kind of crowd. Not just the old Knickerbocker families, but the new money, the theater-goers, the tourists. He designed the hotel's operations to cater to this mix. He envisioned a place that was accessible yet exclusive, a paradox that is the holy grail of hospitality. While the architects worried about the cornice, Muschenheim worried about the flow of linen, the temperature of the soup, and the speed of the elevators. He was the technocrat behind the curtain. He knew that for the illusion of magical luxury to work, the machinery had to be invisible and flawless. He influenced the layout of the kitchens, the design of the ventilation systems, and the hierarchy of the staff. When the Hotel Astor finally prepared to open its doors, it was not just Astor's money on the line. It was Muschenheim's reputation. The partnership was the fusion of old-world capital and new-world efficiency, a combination that would prove to be the engine of the hotel's dominance. The curtain rose on September 9, 1904. The opening of the Hotel Astor was not merely a social event. It was a civic transformation. It coincided with the renaming of Longacre Square to Times Square, a branding shift that signaled the arrival of the modern era. On that night, the mud of the construction site was forgotten, replaced by the gleam of electric light. And oh, the light! The Astor was a beacon. As the doors swung open, thousands of New Yorkers flooded in, desperate to see the inside of the Folly. What they found silenced the skeptics instantly. They stepped off the gritty streets of New York and into a fantasy of the old world. The lobby was a cavern of marble and gold, a space so vast and so ornate that it felt like a cathedral dedicated to the worship of leisure. The air was cool, conditioned by an elaborate system of fans and ice, a technological marvel in a city that usually sweltered in September. The sensory overload was calculated. The smell of fresh flowers, brought in by the truckload, masked the city odors. The sound of an orchestra drifted down from the balcony, drowning out the street noise. It was a total immersive experience. Men in white ties and women in silk and diamonds wandered through the corridors, their eyes wide, touching the velvet, testing the chairs. The Muschenheim brothers stood watch, their eyes scanning the crowd, not for celebrities, but for flaws. A crooked fork, a dim bulb, a slow waiter. The opening night was a declaration of victory. The center of gravity had shifted. The Astor's folly was suddenly the Astor's triumph. The sheer scale of the place was intoxicating. It was a city within a city, offering everything a civilized person could need. You could live there, die there, and everything in between without ever stepping foot on Broadway. The skepticism evaporated, replaced by a desperate need to be seen within those walls. The Astor had arrived, and with it, the modern concept of the Grand Hotel. The heart of the beast was its interiors, a labyrinth of themed rooms designed to transport the guest anywhere but New York. The architects and the Muschenheims understood that luxury is about escapism. They created the orangery at the rear of the lobby, a space that mimicked an Italian garden. The ceiling was a skylight, but not just any skylight. It was draped with artificial vines and lighting that could simulate the rising and setting of the sun. You could sit there in January, amidst the sleet of Manhattan, and feel the warmth of a Tuscan afternoon. It was a lie, of course, but it was a beautiful, expensive lie. Then there was the hunting room, a cavern of dark wood and stag heads, designed to appeal to the masculine fantasies of the robber barons. It was a place for cigars, brandy, and the carving up of railroads and steel trusts. It felt ancient, established, as if it had been there for centuries rather than weeks. But the crown jewel was the grand ballroom. This was the stage upon which the social dramas of the city would be enacted. It was vast, dripping with chandeliers, flanked by balconies from which the envious could watch the privileged. The decor was Louis XV, a riot of gold leaf and pastel murals. It was here that the 400, the elite list of New York society, would eventually deign to gather, lured north by the sheer quality of the food and the perfection of the service. The brilliance of the design lay in its compartmentalization. The hotel offered a stage for every actor. The lonely traveler, the conspiring businessman, the debutante, the politician. Each had a room designed specifically for their script. The corridors were wide, the carpets deep enough to swallow the sound of footsteps. Walking through the Astor was like walking through a museum of comfort, where every chair invited you to sit and every mirror told you that you were part of the elite. Beneath the velvet and the gold leaf, however, lay the machine. A hotel of this magnitude is a biological entity. It must eat, it must breathe, and it must excrete. The downstairs of the Hotel Astor was a subterranean world of brutal efficiency and incessant labor, a sharp contrast to the languid luxury of the upstairs. Deep in the bowels of the building, below the sidewalk level, was the wine cellar, a labyrinth of temperature-controlled vaults holding vintages that cost more than the workers who dusted them would earn in a lifetime. Nearby were the kitchens, vast, tiled factories of food production. Here, the air was hot, thick with steam and the shouting of chefs. It was a military hierarchy. The executive chef as the general, the sous chefs as lieutenants, and an army of peelers, scrubbers, and runners as the infantry. They worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, feeding the beast. The technology was state-of-the-art. The Astor had its own power plant, its own garbage incineration system, its own laundry that could wash and press thousands of sheets a day. It was a self-sufficient organism. The guests upstairs, sipping their champagne, never saw the coal being shoveled into the furnaces or the garbage being hauled away in the dead of night. They never saw the invisible army, the maids who scurried through service corridors, the porters who lugged the massive trunks, the engineers who greased the elevator cables. This separation was the core of the illusion. Luxury requires the erasure of effort. The guest must feel that the clean towel appears by magic, that the meal manifests from the ether. The Muschenheims were masters of this concealment. They designed the hotel with a double circulatory system, one for the guests, wide and beautiful, and one for the staff, narrow and hidden. The two worlds only touched at the point of service, a momentary intersection of the server's hand and the guest's plate, before separating again. The Astor was a monument to this class divide, a vertical city where the rich lived in the clouds and the poor worked in the basement to keep them there. As the years rolled on towards the 1910s, the guest list of the Astor became a roll call of the era's titans. The hotel became the living room of the famous. Mark Twain, with his wild white hair and white suit, was a familiar sight, often found holding court in the lobby, his cynicism softened by the hotel's comfort. He treated the staff with a gruff familiarity, a man who saw through the pomp but enjoyed the service. Diamond Jim Brady, the gluttonous financier, was a regular in the dining rooms, consuming meals that would kill a normal man. Dozens of oysters, entire racks of lamb, gallons of orange juice, all while dripping in enough jewelry to finance a small war. He was the avatar of the Gilded Age, and the Astor was his trough. Then there was Arturo Toscanini, the fiery conductor, who made the Astor his home for decades. He needed silence, absolute silence, and the hotel staff went to extraordinary lengths to provide it, padding the walls and diverting traffic away from his suite. The hotel accommodated the eccentricities of the great because their presence was the best advertising money couldn't buy. Foreign dignitaries, transitioning from the ocean liners to the city, viewed the Astor as the first outpost of American civilization. It was neutral ground. Deals were struck in the men's bar that changed the map of the world. Inventions were sketched on the back of Astor napkins. The hotel attracted the cultural avant-garde as well. It was close to the Metropolitan Opera and the rising theaters of Broadway. It became the place where the actors went to be seen after the curtain fell. To be paged in the lobby of the Hotel Astor, "Call for Mr. Caruso, call for Mr. Caruso," was a status symbol in itself. It meant you had arrived. The building absorbed the charisma of its guests, its walls echoing with the laughter of the most interesting people on earth. It was a high-voltage battery of celebrity, charging the atmosphere of Times Square. But history is a cruel narrator, and the first major crack in the facade came not from the building, but from the sea. In 1912, the sinking of the Titanic sent a shockwave through the Astor empire. John Jacob Astor IV, William's cousin and rival, went down with the ship. While he owned the St. Regis and the Knickerbocker, his death cast a pall over the name Astor in New York. It was a reminder of mortality that money could not bribe. The Hotel Astor, however, stood firm, draped in black bunting, a stone mourner in the heart of the city. The tragedy marked the end of the carefree innocence of the Gilded Age. The world was darkening. The sinking was a prelude to the greater catastrophe of World War I. When the war in Europe began, the mood in the hotel shifted. The German heritage of the Muschenheim family became a point of tension. New York was awash in anti-German sentiment. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage, and suspicion fell on anyone with a Teutonic name. The Muschenheims, loyal Americans and fixtures of the city, had to navigate this minefield carefully. They scrubbed the menus of German names but kept the quality. The hotel became a hub for the Allied cause, hosting fundraising dinners and Liberty Bond rallies. The frivolity of the Diamond Jim Brady era gave way to a more somber, patriotic fervor. Uniforms began to replace tuxedos in the lobby. The hotel was pivoting, showing its resilience. It was no longer just a playground. It was a pillar of the establishment. The Long Room, the famous bar that stretched for over 100 feet, buzzed with talk of U-boats and trenches. The hotel was absorbing the trauma of the nation. It was watching the old world, the world it was modeled after, burned to the ground in Europe, while trying to maintain the standards of civilization in New York. The lights of Times Square dimmed slightly, but the lights of the Astor kept burning, a reassurance that some things, at least, would endure. The end of the war brought a new enemy, one that threatened the very lifeblood of the hospitality industry: prohibition. In 1919, the Volstead Act turned the taps off. For a hotel like the Astor, whose profits and culture were deeply fermented in wine and spirits, this was a catastrophe. The legendary wine cellar, the pride of the Muschenheims, became a liability. The Long Room, one of the most famous bars in the world, was suddenly a dry, melancholy hall serving sarsaparilla and coffee. The soul of the hotel was liquid, and the government had drained it. While smaller, less scrupulous establishments went underground, opening speakeasies and paying off the police, the Astor, with its high profile and reputation, had to comply. It was a giant, unable to hide in the shadows. The clinking of glasses was replaced by the clinking of teacups. The Muschenheims had to reinvent the business model overnight. They focused on food, on banquets, on the sheer experience of dining, trying to compensate for the lack of alcohol with culinary excellence. But the vibrance was gone. The nightlife of New York moved to the side streets, to the hidden doors with sliding peepholes, leaving the grand dining rooms of the Astor strangely sober. It was a difficult decade. The hotel became a place for club luncheons and respectable teas, while the jazz age roared elsewhere. Yet the Astor survived where others failed. It survived because it had become an institution. People still came for the location, for the prestige, for the habit of it. They came to be seen, even if they couldn't get a drink. The hotel adapted, becoming a venue for the elaborate society balls that still required a massive floor, regardless of what was in the punch bowl. It was a dry sanctuary in a wet city, a place where the facade of respectability was maintained at all costs. The Hotel Astor sign still lit up the square, but the light was a little colder, the laughter inside a little more forced. Then came the crash. October 1929 did not just empty bank accounts. It emptied the lobby. The Great Depression descended on New York like a lead blanket. The guests, the men who had speculated on margins and lived in suites, suddenly vanished, some jumping from windows, others simply packing their bags and retreating to smaller lives. The Hotel Astor found itself a palace in a poverty-stricken kingdom. Times Square began to change character rapidly. The theaters struggled, the lights flickered. The lines outside were no longer for tickets, but for bread. The Muschenheims were faced with the impossible task of maintaining a luxury standard when luxury had become a dirty word. The staff was cut, wages were frozen, but the silver still had to be polished, the floors still had to be waxed. A decaying hotel is a sad creature. It shows its age quickly. A threadbare carpet in a palace looks far worse than a bare floor in a shack. The Astor fought a war of attrition against shabbiness. They lowered rates to attract anyone with cash. They hosted conventions, trade shows, anything to fill the cavernous ballroom. The glamour of the Gilded Age was a distant memory. The hotel became a pragmatic space. It was during these years that the Astor solidified its reputation as a political hub. It was a place for grim meetings about the economy, for union negotiations, for the desperate plotting of a recovery. The atmosphere was heavy with cigar smoke and anxiety. The building itself seemed to hunch its shoulders against the economic wind. The bright, optimistic facade of 1904 now looked almost mocking against the backdrop of breadlines. But even in the depths of the Depression, the Astor retained a certain dignity. It was a reminder of what the city had been, and a promise of what it might be again. It refused to close. It kept the lights on, a stubborn refusal to admit defeat in the face of a broken world. World War II brought a strange, frantic energy back to the hotel. The Astor became the unofficial headquarters of the United States Navy in New York. Times Square was the crossroads of the world for servicemen shipping out to Europe, and the Astor Bar was their last stop. The hotel was flooded with uniforms. The Astor Bar became a legendary meeting place, immortalized in the phrase, "Meet me at the Astor Bar." It was a place of hurried romances, of desperate last drinks, of promises made by men who knew they might not return to keep them. The gloom of the Depression was replaced by the adrenaline of war. The hotel was packed again, not with society matrons, but with sailors, soldiers, and the women who loved them. The noise level rose. The polished etiquette of the past gave way to a raucous, smoky intensity. The Muschenheims, patriotic to the core, welcomed the invasion. They turned the hotel into a service center. The ballrooms were used for USO dances, the floors shaking under the jitterbug. It was a different kind of luxury, the luxury of life, lived at high speed before the uncertainty of combat. The Astor was no longer a European palace. It was distinctly, loudly American. It smelled of cheap cigarettes, hair tonic, and beer. It was democratic. The barriers of class that had defined the 1904 opening were smashed by the reality of the draft. A private and a general could stand side by side at the bar. For a few years, the Astor was the heartbeat of the war effort on the home front, a place where the fear of death was drowned out by the jukebox. It was a glorious, chaotic Indian summer for the hotel, a final burst of relevance before the long decline. The building absorbed the stories of a million soldiers, the walls listening to their fears and their bravado. It was a sanctuary for the doomed and the hopeful alike. But when the war ended, the hangover began. The 1950s were not kind to Times Square. The soldiers went home to the suburbs, to the new ranch houses and the manicured lawns of Long Island and New Jersey. They didn't want the noise of the city anymore. The city itself began to rot. The district around the Astor, once the playground of the elite, began to slide into sleaze. Peep shows, burlesque houses, and cheap souvenir shops began to colonize the storefronts. The Astor stood like an aging dowager at a party that had turned violent. The elegance was peeling. The infrastructure of the hotel, pushed to the limit during the war, was failing. The pipes rattled. The air conditioning clanked. The furniture was worn. It needed a massive infusion of capital to modernize, to compete with the sleek, glass and steel hotels rising elsewhere in the city. But the money wasn't there. The Muschenheim era was ending. The ownership changed hands, passing to real estate syndicates who looked at the ledger, not the legacy. They saw a dinosaur. The maintenance costs were astronomical. The sheer number of staff required to run a hotel of that vintage, the elevator operators, the bellmen, the doormen, was economically unfeasible in a world of rising labor costs. The Astor tried to adapt. It hosted high school proms and Shriners conventions. It became a venue for the middle class, losing its aura of exclusivity. The "Meet me at the Astor" catchphrase began to sound nostalgic, a relic of a bygone era. The guests who checked in now complained about the plumbing and the noise from the street. The insulation of the 1904 design could not keep out the roar of the modern city. The hotel was becoming a shell, a grand stage set with no actors to play the parts. The dust was starting to gather in the corners of the ballroom, the first subtle sign of the end. The turning point was mathematical. By the 1960s, the equation was undeniable. The land the Astor sat on was worth infinitely more than the hotel itself. New York was in the grip of an office building boom. Developers were hungry for large footprints of land to build the new vertical filing cabinets of corporate America. The Astor occupied a prime block. It was a horizontal obstruction in a vertical world. The logic of the market is cold and lacks sentiment. A hotel room that sits empty is a loss. A square foot of office space is a guaranteed rent check. The rumors began to swirl. The staff, some of whom had worked there for 40 years, whispered in the kitchens. The guests sensed the neglect. The new owners stopped investing in repairs. Why fix a roof you are planning to tear down? The building entered a zombie phase, still open, still operating, but legally and financially dead. It was a tragic spectacle. The grand lobby, once the envy of the world, now looked tired, the velvet faded, the gold leaf tarnished. It was like watching a great beauty succumb to dementia. The city around it was changing fast. The preservation movement in New York was in its infancy. The destruction of Penn Station had shocked the public, But the legal mechanisms to save landmarks were not yet strong enough to save a commercial property like the Astor. It was private property, and the owners had the right to do as they pleased. The sentiment of the public was, "That's a shame," but rarely "Stop." Progress was the religion of the 1960s. Old was bad. New was good. The Astor was old. It was an embarrassment to the modernists who wanted a clean, efficient city. The decision was made in a boardroom, far from the smell of the old wood and the memories of the guests. The Astor would fall. The announcement of the demolition was a final indignity. It was treated as a business brief, a sidebar in the real estate section. Astor to make way for office tower. The simplicity of the headline belied the violence of the act. There was a flurry of last-minute nostalgia. People came to the hotel for one last drink, to steal an ashtray, to cut a piece of the carpet. A farewell party was held, a grotesque wake where the guests drank to the memory of the building while standing inside its still warm corpse. Then came the auction. This was the stripping of the soul. Everything was for sale. The chandeliers, the silverware, the beds, the mirrors, the very doors. Buyers picked through the carcass like vultures. The ballroom, where Toscanini had conducted and where debutantes had danced, was dismantled piece by piece. The mural-covered walls were ripped out. It was a fire sale of history. To see the contents of the Astor spread out on the sidewalk, tagged with price stickers, was to see the fragility of grandeur. All that effort, all that design reduced to bric-a-brac. The invisible army of staff was let go, dispersed into the city, their institutional memory lost. The Muschenheim legacy was liquidated. The hotel was emptied, leaving only the bare walls and the silence. It stood vacant for a brief period, a dark void in the neon blaze of Times Square. It looked frightened. A building that has lost its purpose is a terrifying thing. It becomes a tomb. The rats moved in where the Vanderbilts had once slept. The windows were boarded up, blindfolding the giant before the execution. Then the wrecking ball swung. We returned to the dust of 1967. The demolition was a slow, grinding process. The Astor was built of stone and brick, built to last 1,000 years, and it fought back. It took months to chew through the masonry. The sight of the half-demolished structure was surreal. You could see the cross-sections of the rooms, the wallpaper still clinging to the walls, the phantom outlines of staircases suspended in midair. It was an architectural anatomy lesson. Passers-by could look up and see the private spaces exposed to the harsh daylight. Look, that's where the suite was. That's the third-floor corridor. It was obscene, this public airing of the building's entrails. The noise was deafening, a constant jackhammering that shook the bones of the neighborhood. The dust coated everything, the hot dog stands, the theater marquees, the pedestrians. It was the cremation ashes of the Gilded Age. The city was inhaling its own past. As the debris piled up, trucks hauled it away to be dumped in the swamps of New Jersey. The physical substance of the Astor, the marble quarried in Italy, the mahogany from the tropics, ended up as landfill, a foundation for a highway or a swamp reclamation project. The irony was total. The material that had constituted the height of luxury was now garbage. When the last wall fell, there was a strange emptiness on the corner. The light hit the street differently. The wind blew harder without the bulk of the hotel to block it. Times Square felt smaller, cheaper, more exposed. The anchor was gone, and the ship was drifting. In its place rose the Minskoff Theater and an office tower at 1515 Broadway. A glass and steel monolith. Efficient, profitable, and utterly soulless. It was a building that could be anywhere: Chicago, Tokyo, Frankfurt. It had no memory, no ghosts. It was a machine for rent collection. The contrast was painful. The Astor had warmth. The new tower had air conditioning. The Astor had shadows and secrets. The new tower had fluorescent lights and open floor plans. The replacement was a testament to the new New York. Functional, corporate, and transient. The warmth of the long room was replaced by a sterile lobby with security guards. The intricate stonework was replaced by curtain walls of glass. The loss was not just aesthetic. It was human. The Astor had been a place of congregation, a public living room. The office tower was a fortress of commerce, closed to the public, designed to repel loitering. The democratization of the space that the Astor had achieved in its later years was reversed. The corner was no longer a place to meet, it was a place to pass through. The transaction was complete. The city had traded a castle for a calculator. Today, if you stand on that corner, there is no plaque, no marker to tell you that the Hotel Astor once stood there. The millions of tourists who swarm Times Square, taking selfies with costumed characters, have no idea that they are walking through the ghost of the ballroom. The history has been successfully erased. But the legacy of the Astor remains in the DNA of the city's hospitality industry. It set the template. It taught New York how to be a host. It defined the idea that a hotel could be a destination in itself. But it also taught a darker lesson, that permanence is an illusion. The Astor warns us that we are merely tenants in our own cities. We build our monuments, we invest them with meaning, we live our lives within them, but the moment the ledger turns red, the stone turns to dust. The Astor was a victim of its own success. It helped build Times Square into a global icon, and in doing so, created the land values that demanded its own destruction. It was an Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail. The luxury gave way to the commercial progress it helped spawn. So what was lost? Not just a building. What was lost was a sense of continuity. When we tear down structures like the Astor, we sever the thread that connects us to the people who came before. We lose the acoustics of their lives. We lose the physical spaces where history happened. The Hotel Astor was a vessel of memory, and we broke it. It reminds us that New York is a city of amnesia, a city that constantly reinvents itself by cannibalizing its own parents. It is a city of the eternal present, where the past is just debris to be swept away. But sometimes, late at night, when the neon is reflecting off the wet pavement and the noise of the traffic lulls for a second, you can almost feel it, the phantom weight of the limestone, the ghost of a revolving door, the faint, impossible sound of an orchestra playing a waltz in the middle of the chaos. The Astor is gone, erased from the map, but it haunts the geography of the imagination, a beautiful, tragic giant that sleeps beneath the sidewalk, waiting for a check-in that will never come. The trap was built, the gold was spent, the guests have fled. All that remains is the story and the dust.